Imagine for a moment that it is early December 1944. The world has been locked in a devastating struggle for 5 long years, but finally, a flicker of light seems to be appearing at the end of the dark tunnel. In the Allied camps across Western Europe, a sense of cautious optimism has taken hold of the men. Having liberated Paris and pushed the German forces back to their own borders, many American soldiers are sitting around small, flickering campfires in the snowy woods, sharing letters from their families and dreaming of a life without the sound of gunfire. There is a common belief whispered in the trenches and shared over meager rations. The war is nearly won, and with any luck, everyone will be home by Christmas. This optimism, however, was a fragile shield against the reality of a desperate enemy who was not yet ready to surrender. Deep within the dark ancient forests of Germany, a far more sinister preparation was underway. While the Allies were planning for a peaceful transition into the new year, Adolf Hitler was obsessively focused on one last, massive gamble to turn the tide of the war. Under the absolute cover of darkness and strict radio silence, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and thousands of heavy tanks were being moved toward the front lines. This operation, secretly named Operation Watch on the Rhine, was designed to be a total surprise. Hitler ordered his generals to move only at night, hiding their vehicles under the thick canopy of the trees during the day to avoid being spotted by Allied scout planes. This massive buildup was a ghost army, a hidden monster gathering its strength for a blow that no one on the Allied side saw coming. The target for this massive strike was the Ardennes forest, a rugged and beautiful region spanning across Belgium and Luxembourg. To the Allied High Command, the Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place where the terrain was too rough for major tank movements and the woods were too thick for a large army to navigate. Because of this, they used the area as a resting ground for exhausted divisions and a training area for new, inexperienced soldiers who had never seen combat. These men, spread thin across a massive front, looked out over a landscape of peaceful snow-covered pine trees and thick blue-gray fog, never suspecting that the ghost front was about to become a slaughterhouse. The silence of the forest was about to be broken by a roar that would echo through history, changing the lives of everyone stationed there. On the morning of December 16, 1944, at exactly 5:30 a.m., the cold winter air was ripped apart by a sound that soldiers later described as the earth itself screaming. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, turning the pitch-black horizon into a flickering wall of orange and red lightning. This was not a standard bombardment. It was a hurricane of steel designed to paralyze and destroy. The shells crashed into the American lines, shattering the frozen trees into lethal splinters and burying men alive in the very foxholes they had dug for protection. For the Americans, the shock was total and terrifying. They had been sleeping in a quiet sector, and now they were at the epicenter of a volcanic explosion of fire and iron that signaled the beginning of the largest land battle in American history. Deep within those foxholes, young American soldiers, some barely out of high school, crawled into the mud to escape the relentless shelling. One such soldier might have huddled in the corner of his shallow pit, his hands pressed tightly over his ears as the ground shook with the violence of 1,000 earthquakes. Every explosion sent a spray of dirt and ice over his shivering body, and the smell of sulfur and burnt wood filled his lungs. The fear was a physical weight pressing down on him in the darkness. He had no way of knowing that this was just the first hour of a battle that would last for weeks. In that moment he was just a terrified teenager in an olive-drab uniform, caught in a storm that seemed determined to erase him from the face of the earth. As the sun began to rise through a thick, choking fog, the true scale of the German threat became visible. Emerging from the gray haze were the King Tiger tanks, 70-ton steel monsters that dwarfed anything the Americans had in their arsenal. These tanks were painted in white winter camouflage, making them look like ghosts as they crushed everything in their path with their heavy iron tracks. The sound of their engines was a low mechanical growl that could be felt in the bone, and their long cannons were capable of destroying an American tank from miles away. Behind these steel beasts marched hundreds of thousands of German infantrymen, their white uniforms blending into the snow. It was a terrifying sight that looked less like a modern army and more like a relentless force of nature. Back at Allied headquarters, the maps that had previously shown a stable front line were now being frantically updated. A massive red arrow was being drawn through the blue American lines, representing the German advance. This arrow created a deep, curved indentation in the front, a massive bulge that threatened to split the Allied forces in half. The strategic goal of the Germans was clear. They wanted to reach the sea and capture the port of Antwerp, cutting off the Allied supply lines and forcing a peace treaty. On the map, the bulge looked like a simple geometric shape, but on the ground, it represented chaos, retreating units, and thousands of men being cut off from their commanders. The Allied leaders realized with a cold dread that their overconfidence had led them into a trap that could lose them the war. The Germans did not just rely on raw power. They also used cunning and deception. A special unit of commandos, led by the dangerous Otto Skorzeny, was sent behind American lines. These men were dressed in captured American uniforms, drove American jeeps, and spoke perfect English. Their mission was to sow confusion and panic. They moved through the snowy woods, switching road signs so that American reinforcements would get lost and cutting telephone wires to silence communication between units. These saboteurs were like ghosts in the machine, making it impossible for the Americans to know if the soldier standing next to them was a friend or a deadly enemy. This psychological warfare turned the rear areas into a landscape of suspicion and fear, where a wrong turn on a road could lead straight into a German ambush. This paranoia led to the creation of improvised checkpoints throughout the Ardennes. American military police, their helmets painted white for camouflage, stopped every vehicle at gunpoint. To catch the German spies, they asked questions that they believed only a real American would know. They asked about baseball scores, the names of movie stars, or the lyrics to popular songs. Even high-ranking officers were forced to prove their identity. General Omar Bradley himself was once detained because he correctly stated that Springfield was the capital of Illinois, but the guard mistakenly thought it was Chicago. In the middle of a massive battle, the American army was forced to stop and quiz itself, a strange and tense necessity caused by the shadow of the German commandos moving through the fog. While the confusion reigned in the rear, a dark tragedy was unfolding in a field near the town of Malmedy. A large group of American prisoners of war, captured during the initial chaos, were being held in an open frozen field by an SS Panzer unit. Without warning and in total violation of the rules of war, the German soldiers opened fire with machine guns on the unarmed prisoners. It was a cold-blooded massacre that left dozens of men dead in the snow. Word of this atrocity spread through the American ranks like a wildfire, turning the battle from a tactical struggle into a deeply personal mission of revenge. The Malmedy massacre steeled the resolve of the American soldiers. They decided then and there that surrender was no longer an option. They would fight to the last man. One of the most critical points on the map was a small Belgian town called Bastogne, where 7 major roads met. If the Germans could take Bastogne, their tanks could speed toward the coast. To prevent this, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was rushed into the town in open-top trucks. These paratroopers arrived in a hurry, many of them still wearing their light summer uniforms and carrying only a few days' worth of food and ammunition. As they drove through the biting wind and snow, they passed retreating units who told them the situation was hopeless. But the paratroopers, known for their toughness, simply checked their weapons and prepared for a fight. They reached Bastogne just as the German circle was closing, becoming a tiny island of resistance in a sea of enemies. Within days, Bastogne was completely surrounded. The town became a landscape of ruins, with smoke from burning buildings rising into the gray winter sky. The 101st Airborne was trapped, cut off from all supplies and reinforcements. The German army launched attack after attack, using their superior numbers and heavy tanks to try and break the American perimeter. From above, the town looked like a target in a bullseye, with the white snowy fields around it filled with the dark shapes of German infantry. Inside the town, the Americans were starving and freezing, but they refused to give up the crossroads. They knew that if Bastogne fell, the entire Allied front might collapse. They were the battered bastards of Bastogne, and they were prepared to die where they stood. The conditions for the men in the foxholes around Bastogne were almost beyond human endurance. The ground was frozen so hard that it was like digging into solid rock. Soldiers had to use small hand shovels and even pieces of broken wood to chip away at the ice, struggling for hours just to create a shallow pit to hide in. Their fingers were often numb and ice crystals formed on their sleeves and eyelashes. Every time they managed to clear a few inches of dirt, the wind would blow a fresh layer of snow back into the hole. The cold was a constant gnawing enemy that never slept, and the soldiers lived in a state of permanent shivering. This was a battle against the elements as much as it was against the German army. On December 22nd, the German commander sent a formal letter to the American headquarters in Bastogne, politely demanding their surrender to avoid total annihilation. He pointed out that the Americans were surrounded and out of supplies. General Anthony McAuliffe, the American commander, read the letter and famously uttered a single word of response: nuts. He then wrote that word on a piece of paper and sent it back to the Germans. When the German officers asked what nuts meant, they were told it was the equivalent of telling them to go to hell. This act of defiance boosted the morale of every soldier in the town. It was a message to the world that the Americans might be surrounded, but they were far from defeated. Life in the Bastogne perimeter became a desperate struggle for survival. Because they were cut off, the soldiers ran out of food and had to survive on frozen K-rations, dry crackers that were almost impossible to chew. They had no way to get fresh water, so they melted snow in metal tins over tiny, smokeless fires, being careful not to reveal their positions to German snipers. They were short on medical supplies, and the wounded were kept in cold, dark church basements, lying on straw while the town above them was pounded by artillery. Despite the hunger and the fear, the men shared what little they had, huddled together in their holes for warmth, and waited for a miracle that seemed further away with every passing hour. The physical toll of the battle was visible in every soldier's boots. Because they were constantly standing in melting snow and frozen mud, many men developed trench foot, a condition where the feet would swell and turn black from the cold. Their leather boots were often frozen stiff, making every step an agony. The laces were coated in ice and the men's socks were permanently wet. In the sub-zero temperatures, even the machinery began to fail. Machine guns would freeze shut and vehicle engines wouldn't start without hours of warming. The soldiers' faces were covered in frost and grime, their eyes sunken from lack of sleep. They looked more like statues of ice than living men, yet they continued to hold their rifles and watch the tree for the next attack. While the 101st held Bastogne, General Georges Patton was preparing to launch a daring rescue. Patton was a man of immense energy and ego, but he was also a brilliant tactician. When he heard about the crisis in the Ardennes, he did something that most generals thought was impossible. He turned his entire Third Army, hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tanks, 90 degrees in the middle of a winter storm and began racing north. Patton lived in his command jeep, pushing his men to move faster than they ever had before. He knew that every hour he delayed meant more lives lost in Bastogne. He was a force of nature in a high-collared coat, determined to break the German ring through sheer aggression. Patton knew that even his tanks couldn't win if the weather stayed bad. The thick fog was preventing the Allied Air Force from flying, which meant the Germans could move and attack with impunity. In a famous moment of faith, Patton ordered his head chaplain to write a special prayer asking God for fair weather for battle. The chaplain wrote the prayer on a small card and distributed it to the troops. It was a request for the sun to shine, for the clouds to part, and for the ghost front to be exposed to the light of day. Millions of men across the front waited in the gray gloom, praying for a change in the sky that seemed trapped in a permanent winter. Then on the morning of December 23rd, the miracle arrived. The heavy gray clouds that had covered the Ardennes for over a week began to tear apart, revealing a brilliant, sharp blue sky and a blindingly bright sun. The great fog was gone. For the American soldiers, the sight of the sun was like a sign from heaven, warming their frozen faces for the first time in days. For the Germans, however, the clear sky was a harbinger of doom. Without the cover of the clouds, their tanks and supply trucks were exposed on the snowy roads, and they knew that the Allied air forces would not miss this opportunity. The weather had officially switched sides and the tide of the battle was about to turn. As soon as the sky cleared, the air was filled with the roar of thousands of Allied planes. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers swarmed over the Ardennes like angry hornets, their silver wings glinting in the sun. They dived low over the trees, firing rockets and dropping bombs on the German tank columns that were stuck in the snow. Smoke trails filled the air as the German supply lines were pulverized. This air power was the hammer that the Allies had been waiting for, and they used it with devastating effectiveness. The German King Tigers, once so terrifying in the fog, were now sitting ducks on the open roads. The industrial might of the United States was finally being brought to bear on the Bulge. The clearing weather also allowed for a massive resupply of the men in Bastogne. Hundreds of transport planes flew over the town, dropping thousands of colorful parachutes, red, yellow, and blue, carrying crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. To the paratroopers on the ground, the sky looked like it was filled with giant flowers. They cheered as the crates landed in the snow, providing them with the strength they needed to continue the fight. The siege was still in place, but the starvation was over. With full stomachs and fresh bullets, the screaming eagles knew they could hold the crossroads forever if they had to. The miracle of the sky had saved the town. By late December, the German offensive had stalled, and the Americans began the slow, grueling process of pushing the Bulge back. The fighting in January was even more difficult than the initial attack. The snow was now several feet deep and the temperatures dropped even further. To hide themselves in the white landscape, American soldiers took white bedsheets from abandoned Belgian houses and wore them over their uniforms as makeshift camouflage. They moved through the woods like white ghosts, stalking the retreating German units through the deep drifts. Every mile of ground they retook was a struggle against both the enemy and the terrain. It was a war of slow, painful steps, retaking one frozen hill at a time. As the Germans retreated, they left behind a trail of destruction that showed the failure of Hitler's gamble. Massive King Tiger tanks, once the pride of the German army, were found abandoned in snowdrifts, their engines silent and their fuel tanks empty. The Germans had run out of the gas they needed to reach the sea, and their steel monsters were now nothing more than rusted landmarks in the forest. The German soldiers who remained were exhausted and demoralized, many of them surrendering in large groups as the American ghosts closed in. The mill had finally ground to a halt, and the Great Watch on the Rhine had ended in a frozen graveyard of German ambition. The cost of this victory was written in the snow of the Ardennes. As the front lines moved back to their original positions, the Americans counted their losses. Over 19,000 men had been killed in just 5 weeks, and tens of thousands more were wounded or missing. The fields were filled with rows of simple wooden crosses, each one representing a life cut short in the cold. A single American helmet sitting on top of a cross became a common sight, a silent tribute to a soldier who would never see the spring. The greatest American battle had been won, but the price was a generation of young men who would remain forever in the soil of Belgium and Luxembourg. Today, 80 years later, the Ardennes forest is a place of peace and beauty once again. The scars of the war have been covered by green grass and new trees, and the sounds of artillery have been replaced by the singing of birds. But if you walk deep into the woods and look closely at the ground, you can still see the circular indentations where the foxholes once were. They are the fingerprints of the past, silent monuments to the men who shivered and fought there in the winter of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge remains a story of human endurance, a reminder that even in the deepest, coldest darkness, the light of courage can never be fully extinguished. The line held, the bulge broke, and the world was saved by those who refused to surrender to the ice.